Hello, and welcome to my critical review video. Over the next little while, you will see footage of my original performance, like this.
They're talking about conducting tests, Stuart!
Sorry?
Stuart! They're talking about conducting tests!
Testing?
Like operations! Oh, he's talking about post-mortem! Stuart, I don't want you to die! You're really important!
I'll be fine.
Seeing pieces of my build-up work towards the production, like this.
Desperation conquers the madness of what you have just done. You feel the cold metal press against the underside of your chin and pull the trigger.
I'm watching clips of an interview with myself describing the creative process of Hellbox, like this.
This entire project so far has been about innovation in notions of reality and emotion. It wouldn't sell it properly to do a critical review in any other form. This video will hopefully show the emotional intensity of the work through how I describe it to you, show to you how much it meant to me, and also show a more creative and novel way of expressing reality.
With that in mind, we start with a shorthand description of the piece itself.
Right, well, the practical performance in the end wound up being an installation of sorts, a kind of not quite promenade, but certainly not conventionally staged piece in which fabricated reality of close to apocalyptic kind of horror scenario where the world, or at least Britain, has been infected with a virus which has been spreading through epidemic across the country and infecting people. It's deadly and naturally as a result of that incredibly dangerous, and so these control centres, emergency control centres, have been set up in various places around the country, one of them being in Milburn House at the University of Warwick. Audience members were brought in 2 at a time for specifically made appointments, and were split up into their own individual experiences, one of which going into being informed that they've been infected with the virus and being put in a cell, the other one being taken into an observation room, and the play out between that was that the person in the observation room gets a say, gets power over the treatment and the eventual fate of the person in the cell.
In the build-up to the production, interviews were released online, expanding the narrative before the day of the performance.
Well, I'm from Portugal. I came here with my family, decided to make a better living because, you know, Portugal right now it's not as bad as Greece, but it's very, very bad economically. So we decided to come here, and, you know, last week my daughter, she started having like nosebleeds, and I talked to the government. Because they had an assistance line. So I called them. They said to take my daughter, and nothing seems to work. I mean, they've taken her. I don't know where she is right now. I don't know what's going on. It's terrible. It's like a nightmare. I don't know what to do. But I do hope that the government keeps their promise and they help us as much as they can, because that's what I'm hoping for, and that's what I came here for, for a new country, to start a new life, not to be in this nightmare that, I don't know.
In my dissertation I wanted to explore innovations of tragedy, taking the original notion of a tragic play or a tragic literary experience of some sort and transforming it into something new. My initial aim was basically as sort of vague as that. I wanted to see what could be done with it that hasn't been done already over the past 3,000–4,000 years. The original thing that I wanted to experiment with was essentialized tragedy, taking the individual emotional chain of experience that happens in a tragic plot and getting the audience to experience that for themselves in a more purified form, seeing if it was even possible to have an Artodian sort of style core emotional experience, getting beyond a lot of the kind of literary structure that comes before it and literally just creating, you know, the sense of knowledge and empowerment exposition with climax and downfall and of course fear and pity, which are obviously derived from Aristotelian the poetics, Aristotle's theories on tragedy. As that developed, I realised that it wasn't so much the experience, the purification of experience that I was trying to seek, but more of a removal of one of the key components of tragedy that I think empathy is a key component of the history of tragedy so far. The fact that you empathise with the characters on stage, with the tragic hero, and feel pity for them and fear of the destruction that they can cause is the absolute fundamental part of the tragic experience. And I was wondering whether there was a way of empowering that even further by removing the empathy altogether and having the experience of the tragic protagonist enacted directly upon the audience member, make the audience member simultaneously the observer and the protagonist of their own personal tragedy. And that's where the initial sort of quest for essentialised experiences came from. I realised after a while that didn't necessarily need to happen because I was basically constraining my own... I was putting myself in handcuffs by having to remove this literary element altogether, when in fact all you need to do is create the plot around the audience member. That's when I started trying my work in progress and creating a sort of interactive tragedy, something that the audience member becomes a key player in themselves and becomes the actual point of the production as opposed to a byproduct of having tragic incidences on stage.
You mentioned work in progress. What did your work in progress consist of, and how did that help formulate ideas for the final dissertation piece?
Well, by the time the work in progress came about, interactive tragedy was my watchword. Briefly experimented with calling it intertragedy, but interactive tragedy, fine, that works better. And so what I did was I created I restricted the plot element of the play to an audio, the medium of an audio experience. So it was almost like one of those old interactive text-based games that you got, like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy or Zork, which came out of the sort of early text-based games in the MIT technology department, or modelling group, I think they were called. And this notion of having a set plot. This is where what I learned from Sylvia Yestrovich comes in, where plot and narrative are the two kind of distinguishable features of an entire story. That the plot is the world, is the world that the play exists in, or the story exists in, and the narrative is the piece that is literally portrayed within the play. So, for example, Oedipus happens, the plot is vast, going back over an entire lifetime of this child. However, the narrative of Oedipus the play goes on in that unified 24-hour period of time in which Oedipus has these revelations and attempts to rescue his city. So I wanted to be able to use inspirations like the text-based game, where you have a wider plot but your narrative is created by your interaction with it. So go north, go east, go west, that kind of thing. Interact with goblin, attack with sword, stuff like that. And the story carries on until there is a crossroads, a point at which things can change. And that's where your influence comes into it. So this interactive tragedy was very sort of bitty, you know, it had a section of story and then your opportunity to change it, and then a section of story and your opportunity to change it. And it played out in that way.
Here is an example of the opening scene and decision of my work in progress project, followed by one of the tragic outcomes at the end of the experience.
A cathedral, ornate and terrible, enshrined in darkness, stands above you. Somehow it writhes in its own long shadows. A gargoyle hangs above you. Its pupilless eyes seem to be fixed upon your neck. Upon entering the front gate, you can see softly inscribed upon the neighbouring wall, "I had a dream which was not all a dream." A carnival is being celebrated on the street outside the cathedral. You step out onto the street to watch the celebration. Your name is Michael, and you do not belong here. The carnival is heaving. There are people everywhere dancing and rejoicing. The music and the crowds are overbearing. The pressure is too much. You don't know if you are shocked or relieved to hear someone cry out your name.
Michael!
You escape from the carnival into an archway that leads into a courtyard. You can hear a voice calling out to you.
Michael!
How does she know you? Her voice is so familiar as you roll the tones of her cries through your head. You cannot place her. However, the realization is creeping over you that, through some fog of a distant memory, you love her. You step into the courtyard and see her at a balcony staring down at you. There are strong, ancient vines growing up the side of the building to her balcony. They look like they could be climbed. You realize she has fallen silent, and you stare through the stillness at each other's faces. You have to do something. She's waiting for you to do something. You can feel the words building in your throat. They don't feel like your own. What can you do? You can speak, climb the vines, or leave.
At this point, the audience member has the opportunity to choose one of the three paths before them. This continues in the same frame, turn after turn, until they come to a tragic ending in the story. One like the one that follows.
You turn and accidentally collapse through the doorway and onto the floor of the room. You look up to see a man standing over the body of Madeline. Blood is dripping down her crimson dress. She must be dead. The man steps towards you as you helplessly try to collect your drunken limbs from the cold slate floor. The man pulls a knife from his belt with his left hand and lifts you bodily with his right. He forces you to the window, forces the knife to your chest, and pushes you out of the window. As you fall, it feels as if you were hanging for a split second in space, before you crash horribly to the ground and begin to feel the world fade away.
And so we had a single audience member sitting in a chair in a darkened room, having the first bit of audio played, and they made a decision as to whether they were going to join the carnival outside a castle, or walk into the castle and enter a bar, or interact with their supposed lover. And I informed the person entering this experience that their job was to come out of it unscathed. There was a way of achieving, if not a happy ending, then a balanced ending, a not tragic ending, when in actual fact every single choice you made resulted in admittedly different but always tragic consequences. So you could die or cause the death of another, or have in some way blood on your hands. And that was a way of exploring how someone's own sense of culpability, how their own sense of peril can be affected as a protagonist of a tragedy. Now, it was successful in some ways. People's imaginations really engaged with it. People really started to imagine this world that was going on around them. However, what I discovered was there wasn't enough of a sense of personal culpability because it was so restricted. There was still a sense that with 2 or 3 options, you didn't have enough. You were still being forced by these gods of fate, of the game, of the rules of the game itself, to create a tragic outcome. Which, well, yeah, while I'm on that, has a definite connection to tragic heritage. I mean, I was basing most of my theories of how to expand this off Aristotle's Poetics, because they're just kind of the original text. They are what we've based so much of our tragedy on. And the interplay between the tragic hero's fundamental flaw, their tragic flaw, and the will of the gods to exploit that is what creates the power of the tragic outcome. And the will of the gods was very much there in this experience. That was well placed. You could see that it was almost always fated to be so. What I wanted was to be able to create the fundamental flaw through the notion that the person had failed, that they could have made it work but didn't, and that didn't come across quite well enough. So my mission from there was to try and find a way that can be more powerful, that someone can feel that their flaw is more palpable, more direct, and more real.
The audience enjoyed feeling that they were dabbling in a world that was larger than their experience of it. However, they felt too constricted by the lack of personal investment they had in the decisions they made. There was no more moral dimension, just dumb luck. These next clips hopefully exemplify both the success and the failings of the work in progress.
You step back out towards the carnival. As you're walking, you feel a weight on the side of your belt. Your hand absent-mindedly drifts towards it before shocking back to your side. You are carrying a gun, one that you do not remember owning. There seem to be a good number of things occurring that are beyond your control. The carnival is louder and moving faster than when you left. The participants seem to be dancing to the point of mania. You do not belong here. A young woman dressed as a court jester dances towards you, then stops with interest on her face as she sees your expression.
Why aren't you joining in the carnival?
I don't feel like celebrating.
It's always worth celebrating. If you're unhappy, celebrating the things that make you happy is a great way of reminding yourself why you're alive. If you're happy, it'll only serve to amplify the happiness.
And what if I don't want to be happy?
Everyone wants to be happy.
The girl touches your arm. As she does this, an unexpected feeling begins to well up inside your chest. A wave of desperate energy starts spreading through you, and before long, you're consumed with an overwhelming, frantic and bitter happiness. Against every fibre of your nature, you feel you have to celebrate, to shout out, just to release the pressure that is rupturing your heart.
Hooray! Hooray! Carnival! Carnival is here! Happy?
I already was.
The jester girl dances away. The pressure inside you still has not abated. There is a spirit consuming you that you cannot avoid. More action must be taken. Your hand drifts back to the gun. You just want the carnival to stop. There is a doorway in the side of the cathedral to your left. You can run into the cathedral, shout out to the people, or fire the gun.
But it was clear to see that the relationship the audience had forged with this story wasn't quite as I wanted it to be. So the next thing to do was to attempt to make that connection that much more powerful. So I started looking at situations that are more dimensional, more immersive, but can still leave you with a sort of moral conflict. Because looking at, for example, back to Oedipus again. Oedipus is a good one. One of the tragic flaws that Oedipus possesses is this notion of nobility, that he really wants to save the city beyond all other things. He commits himself to a point at which he says, whoever it is that is causing the curse to befall my city, my kingdom, must be cast out, must be dealt with. You know, there is no tolerance for this, regardless of who they are. And his own dignity and his own wish to do things honourably is what, in the end, causes him to fail. And there is a notion, there is a common factor between those who aren't, well, sociopathic, to try and save the people around them, to try and cause the least harm that they can. And I wanted to try and play off that, so I started looking at crisis situations, moments where someone is going to be put in a situation where they have lives in their hands and they want to save them. And then basically punish them for it, allow them to suffer tragic consequences as a result of their weakness. If they need to save one person in the face of the good of the many, then the punishment comes from their sentimentality, their notion that the person in front of them, the fleshy, existent person in front of them, wasn't the most important thing to save. Then the punishment is clear. If the person then goes on to cause a huge amount of damage, if Oedipus then causes the curse to befall the kingdom, then they need to be punished for that. And then hopefully realisation of the tragic flaw that comes at the end of the tragic structure, and hopefully achieving some kind of more powerful sense of catharsis at the point of leaving the tragedy. If they decide to save more people, if they decide to allow the person in front of them to suffer or die or whatever else, in the favour of the greater good, then that's the moment at which exposition of the fate of the gods comes in, that in fact this person was never a threat in the first place, that they could have made a better decision to find out more information, that they could have done something else that could have been better, or they could have just made the more emotive decision to allow that person to live and hope that it's okay. Either way, it's not tragic unless the wrong decision was made somewhere along the line, unless there was a flaw. And I wanted to be able to make that, I suppose, promenade, more related to a piece that feels like the ramifications are genuine, with some level of suspension of disbelief, just for the sake of not entire cruelty. The point of, with all of this talk of punishment, the point of the creation of the piece isn't just abstract punishment, it's attempting in some way to allow for emotional catharsis, to allow for a cleansing in a more potent way than tragedy in a little black box in the corner of your room on a screen, or behind a nice safe proscenium arch in front of you does, because that's limited, that's removed. Empathy is something that is universal but not completely unavoidable, whereas a sense of personal responsibility is far more potent.
In order to expand the narrative of Hellbox, I added the subplot of Sarah Hawkins, a woman that had apparently been infected with the virus and then vanished without trace after visiting a UKDC treatment centre. This video was posted on the Resistance website days before the performance, with a few clues as to its whereabouts sent out to prospective audience members.
My name's Sarah Hawkins, and I'm been a patient at the treatment centre. Yeah, I was ill with the virus. I was ill with the bug. When I got back to my flat, my boyfriend had started to have nosebleeds too, and then he became quite sick, and he went to the hospital, but he didn't make it through. Yeah, the people at the treatment centre were actually really lovely. They were really kind, and
Fuck, she's got a nose. Get her out!
Just to avoid any confusion, it's probably worth noting that the performer in that video playing Sarah Hawkins also came to see the production, and appears as an audience member elsewhere in this video. She didn't know any more information about the play than any other audience member on the day, and she performed as herself, and not the character portrayed in the clip.
Well, part of the technique of creating this play was giving a sense of a wider world, which was why everyone who signed up to see the piece got a series of news bulletins and emails from the UKDC, the UK Disease Control Centre. Yeah, UK Disease Control. It was called UK Disease Control. They got emails from them informing them of the gravity of the thing, sort of approaching them, and yeah, BBC articles saying how the virus had spread, but also hidden messages from a resistance group who were working on the assumption that, well, not the assumption, but working on pieces of evidence that the government was in fact orchestrating the entire deadly element of the spread of the epidemic, that in fact they were using it to execute dissidents or something else. The part of the character of the resistance was that they were conspiracy theorists. They were people who could be written off as nutters, that you couldn't have any direct piece of proof that they were right, but enough to put a doubt in your mind as to what exactly you were doing there and why everything that was happening. All of this was in order to give a bit more depth to the plot, I suppose, the narrative of this entire story, so that this reality again blossoms and becomes more and more real and engaging. As D-Day approached, as the time at which he had to go into the UKDC centre approached, then the resistance emails got more and more frantic. There were more and more posts on a secret website that if you followed the right clues from what you were looking at, you could find, which was the centre point of the resistance.
Following up on the Sarah Hawkins story, the Resist website posted a scrambled video of what looked like her in a cell in some distress. I then created a series of characters who were part of the Resistance forum discussing how real or indeed dangerous the video is, and how they managed to get hold of it. This was the day before the production, building into a resolution on the day itself.
Well, during the performance, two things from the sort of outside world infected this this production. The person who is declared to be infected during the production is taken to one side, put in a room, and one of the members of the resistance sneaks in and informs them that they're being set up. Looks extremely nervous, gives very scatty information, doesn't really appear convincing, but still seems to have a definite motivation for doing this. And so instantly that part of the resistance becomes real and something that's worth chasing afterwards. The person, upon leaving the cell, in fact both the observation room and leaving the cell, is handed a business card with the UKDC kind of seal on it, and a phone number. Signed on the back, it says call the number, signed by Resist. And upon calling the number, he got through to the UKDC emergency control hotline. However, the standard "you have reached the emergency control hotline" section suddenly dissipates with a kind of static as if it's being hacked into, and all of a sudden another message comes over the top of it, which is a whispered URL, a website, which then directs you to the Resist website again, at which point more information had been posted about the outcome of the process of that day.
Welcome to the NHS Disease Control Centre. We are currently experiencing
www.resist.co.cc.
That was created with the hope that there'd be a notion of ramification of the action of the time following it that would take that to a further level. I wish I'd taken more time to really expand the narrative and carry it on for much longer instead of just the day of the production, but some things don't work out, I suppose. However, it was very effective, and seeing audience members afterwards calling the number and have that moment of shock in their eyes as another voice came over the top indicated to me that there was some level of success in that.
The production itself was filmed from 3 different angles, one in the observation room and 2 in the cell. Unfortunately, it wasn't possible to capture the performance building up to these 2 rooms. However, the majority of the action does take place in these locations. This clip joins Kate, as she is shown into the observation room, as yet unaware that her friend Stuart is going to be the patient that she has to decide the fate of. During the clip, you may see that when it is eventually settled that Stuart is to be medically examined, the members of staff in the cell close in around him as if to perform further tests, but instead, one of the guards pulls off his own mask and paints fake blood across his face to make it look like Stuart has attacked him and potentially infected him with the virus. At the same time, in the observation room, I lean across the television as if to point something out so that Kate cannot see the process and is only made aware of the aftermath. The story develops from there.
Just sure we're not interrupted. Right. Well, I better fill you in on the symptoms and what we're going to do about it. Basically, okay. The predominant symptoms of the virus, as far as we can tell, are nosebleeds, nausea, vomiting. Also, something that's been a real struggle is irrationality and paranoia.
Right.
And unfortunately, paranoia extends into a fear of doctors, and often we've found that us as authority figures are mistrusted, which makes it very difficult to treat patients, which is part of the reason why we've brought in the public juror scheme, where we've got a member of the public who is there to regard ethical issues, take care of another member of someone outside of the organisation. We're going to bring in one of our routine patients, in a few moments. Hold on, let me just... Sergeant, have we got patient 335? Yes. Fuck. Well, all right, bring him in. There's been a slight change of plan. One of the public jurors coming in for the project hasn't passed screening. We think he might be infected with the virus.
Is it my friend?
Mr. Stuart Clark?
Yeah.
Right, we're going to need you to step in as the juror for his case.
That's definitely not okay. I don't want to do that.
It's within your right to be able to release him at any moment, but I should warn you, if he is infected, it could cause the death of thousands of people.
Okay.
We have a series of tests that we can do. The most effective thing we can do, as I'm really sorry to say, is to conduct a post-mortem.
Oh my god, okay.
We need to sample some of the tissue of the cerebral cortex to be able to see what strain of infection he's got. The surgery can be done live, but it's extremely uncomfortable and often fatal, unfortunately.
Okay.
I'm going to confirm he's all right, and see if we can bring him in. Please hold that for me.
Okay.
Yeah, bring him in. I don't, just bring him in. Right, he's coming in now.
Okay.
We'll ask him a series of questions, see if we can get more information from him, and then we can take further steps from there.
Okay. What's he wearing?
We give out scrubs to patients. Sure.
This probably isn't okay. Can I say I want to release him already? Like.
You can. I would recommend that we conduct further tests first.
Oh, okay, fine.
Right.
Where is he? Can I see him?
You can speak to him if you want.
Yeah, I really want to.
Okay. Mr. Clark? Mr. Clark, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, I'm Mr. Forrester. I'm the lab technician. We're going to be asking you a few questions. First, apparently our juror knows you. She wants to...
Stuart!
Hello?
Hello! Are you okay?
Yeah. I've been given something that someone else...
No, Stuart, I can see you! I can see you on a TV screen. I know, but it's not fun because Stuart, listen, like, I'm basically in charge of you now. No, Stuart! No, it's not amazing. Stuart, calm down. Stuart, just listen, Stuart.
Yes.
It's not okay, like, I don't know what's going on, but this is definitely not okay, like...
Miss Piss, we need to put on.
Okay, they're gonna ask questions, but, like, okay, I'll talk to you in a second.
Right, Mr. Clark, do you mind if I ask you a few questions?
Yes.
Right, first up, I need you to tell me if you have any reason to suspect you've been exposed to someone infected with the OX virus in the past few weeks.
No.
No, you're certain?
Yes.
Do you believe you've exhibited any symptoms, nosebleeds, nausea, vomiting, instability, inability to stay upright?
No.
Keep standing up, Stuart!
I'm very well.
Right. You say you haven't had any nosebleeds?
No.
Mr. Clark, I have to ask you, why is there blood on your shirt?
It's not my blood.
It's not your blood.
No.
I believe him.
Right. Would you hold there for a second, please?
It's really dry, look at it. Really dry.
I believe you, Stuart!
Yes, you do.
I do!
I know this is very difficult.
Look, I see this.
Stuart, just do what they're saying!
Right. This seems to me that he's entered a really aggravated state, extreme paranoia. It strikes me that he is exhibiting a lot of symptoms of being infected. We can conduct further tests. We've already taken a blood sample, and that's going through the lab now. We don't know when the results will come back, but we can conduct non-invasive tests medically, or we could bring in an interrogator and ask him some more questions, if you think that's wise.
Oh God, I don't know. I think he's okay. I don't...
We can. You are completely within your rights to release him at any moment if you really believe he's okay.
Well, if you think it's best to run tests, like, we can do that. That's fine. I don't know. Like,
Okay.
whatever.
Sergeant, can you bring in Dr. Browning? We're going to do some more medical tests. Mr. Clark, please sit down.
I'm upright.
Keep standing up, Stuart!
Mr. Clark, the more you cooperate, the easier this is going to be for everybody.
I'm not dissenting.
Can I talk to him? Stuart, listen to me. I think if you do what they say, I'm more likely to be able to look after you.
Oh, you're being very cryptic.
No, I'm not, Stuart, just do what they say. So sit down, Stuart, sit down for us.
Want to?
Stuart.
I think you're deceiving me, Kate.
No, Stuart!
I don't know.
Stuart, I'm trying to do right by you.
Gloves. I have gloves.
Oh.
I'm telling you, the paranoia at this stage can get extreme. I don't want to push it too far. Right, I'm just going to get confirmation for us to continue. Miss Pierce, are you confirming that this operation can actually carry on?
Yes, okay.
Right, okay. Dr. Browning, you can proceed.
Okay. You're going to take a simple DNA swab to check for the virus spirit.
Please don't hurt him.
Watch his reaction.
Leave for a moment, please. Okay?
Just across there.
Oh, Jesus Christ! He's got a mask on! He's got a nose!
Get out of there now! Mr. Clark, that was not wise. Please stay quiet and stay still. Miss Pierce, this man is getting dangerous. Look, he's infected. Hang on. Sergeant? Yes, doctor, yeah. Look, get the staff doctor on him. Fuck. I think the sergeant's been infected. We need to ascertain what strain of the virus he's been infected with now. We need to either terminate, conduct a post-mortem, or perform surgery on him. I have to remind you, you are still within your rights to release him, but at this point, that would be extremely dangerous.
I don't know. I don't want to hurt him. Like, I really don't want to hurt him.
Time is of the essence, Miss Pierce.
Well, let him go. Let him go.
Are you sure?
Okay, don't worry.
I don't want to hurt you. They're talking about conducting tests, Stuart.
Sorry?
Stuart, they're talking about conducting tests.
Testing.
Like operations. Oh, he's talking about post-mortem. Stuart, I don't want you to die. You're really important.
I'll be fine.
Miss Pierce, I really recommend that we do something to try and save our staff. He is going to go out and he's going to infect more people.
I don't think you will.
No, I'm letting go.
Are you sure? Dr. Browning, we have confirmation. Mr. Clark's going to be released.
Are you sure? No, I'm not sure.
Wait, hold on.
No, do the test. Sorry, Stuart!
Right, we have an okay to carry on with the surgery.
Yes.
Mr. Clark, please get on the bed.
Wait. What does the surgery involve? No.
Right, thank you. We want final verbal confirmation from the patient that from our juror, that if the patient is to die in this procedure, that it has been accounted for and she's aware of the risks. Are you aware of these risks, Miss Pierce?
Sorry?
Yes. Sorry. Yeah.
Right. Miss Browning, please carry on with the surgery.
Please look after him. Please don't hurt him.
Right. There's no need for you to see this.
What? No. Oh.
I'm sorry. We can't permit you to see the surgery. Please.
God. Okay.
Confirmations.
Full stop. We have a quarantine breach. Please restrain.
The effect in certain cases was bang on exactly what I was aiming for. A good number of the audience members had an extraordinary emotional experience going through the play, both in the cell and in the observation room. What I discovered was still arguably a flaw with it was that having such a moral imperative enacted on people in something which claims to be so real can really break some people's sense of the utility of the cathartic process, as in that safety barrier is there for a reason. That box in the corner of the room, that proscenium arch, is there so that you don't feel you have to interfere, so that you can feel emotionally secure, so that the function of the catharsis can be under your own control, can be more mildly therapeutic than directly curative. And what people were looking for out of the production changed a lot, depending on their structure. Another point which probably should have been considered more was the audience that came to see it. I mean, I'd created this piece with the notion of universality, that a language of emotion is something that's pretty global. However, of course, I was opening my doors to a very limited audience thanks to time slots and things like that. There was no marketing or anything like that. It was literally just people within the department, which included staff and students, and putting the staff in a situation where sometimes they were directly responsible for what was very real fear, and at times, it was suffering for leisure, but it was still suffering. Put them in a difficult position. It wasn't really something I'd taken into account ethically or emotionally as to what impact that would have upon the staff's experience.
Yeah, a couple of days ago my daughter started to have nosebleeds. Obviously I'd heard about the virus, so I called up. They took her quite quickly, and I found out an hour ago that she was terminated. I mean, it's tough, it's a shock, it's hard to deal with, but I'm glad I did it, because we need to stay alive.
The ethics of innovating or creating new forms of tragedy are prickly. They're very difficult things to try and negotiate around, because there is a set social contract around tragedy. There's a convened understanding of what is going to be created for you, what you're going to leave with, and what's expected of you during that process. It is contained and it is safe. Creating a more real sense of peril happens in Promenade. I mean, you look at Punch Drunk, you look at Faust and Mask of the Red Death, and a couple of their productions beforehand, and there was a sense of wildness and an interaction with the audience that was far more direct, and sort of ethical questions were thrown up about that, but even then the audience were rarely put in a position where they feel responsible for what goes on. And what was very dangerous about my piece was its entire point is to make you feel responsible. In actuality, in the grander scheme of it, there is no escaping it. You are going to enact some level of tragic outcome. However, you do have the choice to limit that to just yourself. If this is on the condition that you're in the observation room, the outcome is in your hands to a great extent, and you can when viewing it outside of the world of the play, viewing it as literally a performance, not suspending your disbelief and treating it as if there is a person right there in that room who is that's an actor and that's another audience member. You can restrict the amount of suffering that spreads beyond yourself. Once your belief is suspended, once you buy into the conditions of the play, then you aren't really in control anymore. You have an illusion of control. You can affect the details of the outcome, the statistical element, the factual element. However, you can't avoid the downfall. You can't avoid the tragedy. And so, not knowing that coming into the production is ethically shaky territory. However, the name of the play was Hellbox. It was billed as a tragedy. It was known to be a tragedy. And so long as you buy into that world, so long as you invest yourself into that suspension of disbelief, then all you can do is act. All you can do is allow that to be. The notion of responsibility was very touch and go. It was completely dependent on a very active investment in the world of the play. I'm not sure it could have been expanded to a general public as they understand it to be, because you basically have to be an actor to really engage in the world. You have to be able to really love this notion of losing yourself in this world. And that was clear by who elected to join the Dance Macabre and who elected to try to avoid the confrontation of the piece. And yet the audience I aimed at, a good portion of them, like I said, couldn't engage in that way because it's too stark, it's too dangerous. And so it's almost that the piece in itself is fundamentally flawed because there isn't quite an audience for it, or at least the audience is so slim for it that it's almost not worth the risk. This tragic contract has existed for millennia and can't be messed with overnight. This was a research project. You know, as much as it was a practical creation, it was for the purpose of understanding more about tragedy and what can be done with it. I'd possibly give more warning to the people engaging in it, but I'd change the target audience. I'd change who it was for and who was going. The production itself I would keep largely the same, bar a couple of production assistants so that details could be picked up on. But the intellectual outcome of this production has been invaluable to my understanding of creating theatre and will hopefully allow an expansion of people's understanding of what tragedy can do and what it should or shouldn't do. The piece was so complicated by the end, having 4 performers improvising around each other, around a building, and having to coordinate information between them that is privileged that the audience member can't necessarily know at the moment they're experiencing it, had to be coordinated very carefully. So I wasn't my first choice for casting. It was literally that understanding the outcome and knowing, because so much of it was rooted in the theory itself, enacted literally on the day, that guiding the improvisation and sort of live directing of the play had to happen from the principal character. And that was me. So in terms of a review of a performance, I don't think I did too badly. Performing isn't my first thing, isn't my first skill, so it would have been very interesting to have more resources to be able to expand the production to a point at which I could be live coordinating it from an external place, having all of the communication put together, and have enough time and structure to train an actor to run in my place as that main character. However, practicality insisted otherwise. I'm a designer. It's the main thing that I do. I like doing light and sound design and set design on top of it, so creating this world in a more convincing way was a really vital part of it. Having the observation room scoured with Dettol so that it smelt of a hospital was very important to me, and something that was commented on afterwards by some of the audience members, that it really felt that much more real. Also in the cell, again, scrubbing the place with Dettol and having hidden outside of the sort of gauze that created two sides of the cell, the sounds of hospital machines, heart rate monitors, sort of hums and twangs and mechanical things that people associate with a sort of very human desperation, a very human threat to their health and well-being, and yet something that's sustaining them. This notion that they were fetal, that they were inside this womb, and some performers commented on how, not performers, some audience members commented on how they felt their heart rate sync up with the heart rate monitor, and how they were affected by, that was another part, I brought in pieces of music, just very, very softly, at key moments of the narrative, for them to literally just very softly play underneath the level of the hospital machines, so to the point at which it could have just been someone's radio passing by, or not even consciously absorbed, but affected emotionally the ambience of the room. The websites were registered as .co.cc domains, which are not listed on search engines and not available to the general public, only if you have the URL available, and all of the clues to the URL were restricted purely to the people who went to see the play. You know, it's difficult enough shaping a process which is so directly codified for one individual member, but for two that becomes a very different feature, especially when they're affecting each other. The more complete tragic experience, literally the one that fed into a notion of what a tragic play is, was in the observation room. There was still a sense of empathy, although it was a real empathy, not a wouldn't this be horrible if this happened, but this is horrible, this is happening notion. Fear was very much a feature, pity was very much a feature, and the flaw was theirs, the tragic flaw was theirs. However, for the person in the cell, this notion of powerlessness in the face of the gods was far more potent. The gods of, well, depending on how you decided to interpret this production, the gods of fate were either the government and the institution that was controlling this, or indeed a grander notion of sort of secular gods of fate, mathematics, probability, just bad luck. However, you were also very heavily reminded of your smallness in all of this by the fact that the voice coming from the people in the observation room was from above. The speaker was put directly above the person in the cell. And they were a disembodied voice, they were a deified entity in themselves. So that notion of powerlessness, combined with being asked questions, being given a sense of autonomy by the resistance member coming to warn them not to cooperate, to try and find a way to get out, hopefully gave them a sense of personal responsibility themselves, but for more than anyone else, just themselves. And if you really bought into the world, if you really suspended your disbelief, it wasn't implausible that you were infected, that these people were telling you the truth, and that you should in fact obey, and that you should try and find a way of getting treated, of not infecting other people. So the decision was left in both people's houses, and that wasn't that couldn't have been more clearly shown than when two of the audience members who came in together decided to communicate outside of the structure we'd set up. So the person in the observation room asked to speak to the person in the cell. In fact, that happened twice, that they wanted to have unencumbered communication with the person. And on this second time, the person in the cell eventually broke out, overpowered the guard, and made his own decision, very much dictated his own fate, and got out of there. And that was extremely powerful. That was a huge moment of dramatic realisation. And for the audience member in the observation room, tragic, because that person had just condemned the person in the cell to death, and had had this huge wave of emotional experience that was so clear to see in how she was reacting. And then, having decided this person had to die in order to save the people outside of the centre, saw them run away, and saw them not only lost, in that context, lost a friend, although of course after the process was over they were fine, but not only in this little world lost a friend, but also caused havoc for the people out there in the world, and hadn't dealt with it in the right way. You have to tread a careful line, even more careful in this instance, between the fiction and the reality. I was never actually going to be able to kill anyone, and it wouldn't be effective if it did. I mean, it's not about making the people suffer. It's about giving people the tools to overcome suffering. That's what tragedy is arguably for. Oliver Taplin at Oxford University talks extensively about tragedy in a really interesting kind of way. The way that he protests to this notion of catharsis in response to tragedy. He says that catharsis implies that you're letting something go, that you're giving up a piece of yourself, that you're going to this place and then going, oh, I dismiss myself, I dismiss this experience. It is just literally a process of cleansing. I'm taking out my emotions. I'm jettisoning what I carry. He says it's much more like an inoculation. That there's a sense that you aren't using tragedy to dispose of things, but to take more on. That you're going through these emotional experiences in order to develop the immune system, the emotional immune system, develop the tools to deal with the world, with the evils that the world does expose, which comes a lot more into a Nietzschean sense of tragedy, that there's a level of kind of nihilistic education going on through seeing tragedy and seeing those things go on. I didn't want to just pummel people coming into this with misery and pain. It's about allowing people through a pleasurable pain to find out how to feel in depth, how to really know how to react with desperate situations, and to have a device they can carry with them, an experience they can carry with them that has enriched their lives. That's just as important as the cathartic element. I think there's a way of negotiating between the two, because clearly it was very effective for a series of people who went to it as a cleanser, as a way of living out another world and really feeling purified. But that purification is emotional, and what you can carry away from the tragedy can be intellectual as well. Money. It would be really good to have more money to create more with the production. It would have been wonderful to have the heart rate monitor actually hook up to the individual and then be able to subtly tweak it so the person gets used to that being their own heart rate, and then start to change the pace of it so they start to consciously see a differential, which would be confusing and interesting as a thing to enact upon someone in terms of powerlessness. It would have been really good to be able to expand that world to a much greater degree. I mean, again, born out of Aristotle was this sense of the unity of time and space, and that was definitely created in the experience. What I would have loved to take would be a more modern approach of that expansion, and really have the world created on a much larger scale, have the Resistance posting lots and lots of videos and lots of information, having these emergency centres created in different places, and having a larger cast for people to be able to bring in, you know, people in the Resistance raiding the centre and things like that, have much more of a sense of an expanded reality, and take more time to invest the actors in the improvisational side of it, so that we could have an entire huge plot that these people weave in and out of. There was a section of the Henry V prologue that kept on popping into my mind throughout creating the production, and I'm trying to remember it. Think of when we talk of horses. Tell you what, I'm going to cut back to me reading it in just a second. Think when we talk of horses that you see them, printing their proud hoofs in the receiving earth. But 'tis your thoughts that now must deck our kings. Carry them here and there, jumping o'er times, turning the accomplishment of many years into an hourglass, for the which supply admit me chorus to this history, who prologue-like your humble patience pray, gently to hear, kindly to judge our play. It sounds so much like Shakespeare's aware of the unities of time and space, and that he's trying to expand it, jumping around the place like the metaphorical horse, that the whole expansive tragedy doesn't have to be contained. And that was what I was trying to think of when creating this production, that that sense of containment can be lost, can be, well, not lost, but can be expanded upon, that you can take that out and the container doesn't have to be just the theatre, it can be the world that the tragedy is enacted within. Feedback was largely positive. A lot of people were very excited by it, very excited by the entire experience, and seeing people really affected by it afterwards, and feeling so much like they'd had a huge experience, that they were really glad that they'd come and experienced this sort of bizarre tragedy. Was very good. It made a lot of people nervous. It was a very new thing, and we had some people in tears, we had some people really on the edge of their own kind of rational interaction with the world, and that was extraordinary. It was really fascinating to see the effect of what would have had to have been a really, really great conventional tragedy coming out in a production that was created by a bunch of students. You know, it wasn't even highly budgeted, wasn't especially inventive, it was just there. And there was something very powerful in that component. There's been a lot of reading of tragic theory, reading a lot of Greek texts and reinterpretations of Greek texts, looking into the history of tragedy. There was this huge gap in the history of performance of tragedy, that once the kind of classical civilizations lost a hold of it, it wasn't until the Renaissance that we re-engaged with it, and Grecian tragedies took a while to sort of take off again. Racine's Phaedra was such a kind of seminal work in the reincarnation of Greek tragedy, and that was a big part of my influence in terms of structure and a sort of controlled recreation of ancient tragic notions. Looking into reinterpretation in the modern era, look at films such as Magnolia, which has an entirely new, separated notion of this kind of nihilistic tragedy, this sense of emptiness that's born out of more of a kind of Beckett type humorous, desperate tragedy that leaves you in this absurdist world that you don't really know how to interact with. Looking at Nietzsche's distinctions between Aristotle's thought that tragedy is to educate. You know, in the Greek world, you didn't perform a tragedy, you taught a tragedy. That was how the etymology worked, and Nietzsche wanted to distinguish between that and more of a notion of an independent interaction to it. Looking from those to a whole load of kind of other ideas of theatre and how you expand that world and how you lose yourself in something that's made more real. Looking at productions like Void, or anything created by Punch Drunk, which has that real darkness around it. A few people compared the production to a kind of clinical psychological experiment, which was quite apt. One of the first things that I read were Dr. Zimbardo's notes from the sort of infamous Zimbardo experiment on how putting people into this fictionalized world with power play and things like that affected the mindset of the people who volunteered to enter the experiment, and that was very interesting to see how unnervingly similar, even in a few minutes, his observed reactions were to those involved in the production, those who really invested in the production. Claustrophobia, of course, implies an irrational relationship to small spaces, but the enclosed nature of the world you were brought into, or of the space you were brought into as opposed to the world you were brought into, and timelessness in a very short period of time, gave people a very difficult relationship with power. And that completely dictated in different ways how people related to it. Those who already felt some notion of power and responsibility at times were made uncomfortable by the feeling that they were still holding that in one reality and losing it in another. Whereas those who walked in feeling unempowered sometimes relished in having this greater sense of personal responsibility, which was exactly what Zimbardo felt and found when he called the experiment off early. It was something to very much be aware of and to be careful around. These are the things that hopefully inspired something good in this production.